Ours is a divided world. Since the Second World War, international politics have been dominated by antagonisms between the communist East and the capitalist West. But in recent years, economists and politicians have focused on another division, that between the rich nations of the North and the poor ones of the South. Cancun, Mexico. At the end of October, 22 heads of state will meet in this tropical resort to discuss some of the world's most pressing problems. Both North and South face growing economic difficulties. In the North, the economic recession is causing serious concern for the future. And in the South, the problem of poverty appears to have no solution. For many years now, the North-South dialogue has been at a standstill. The North's main concern has been finding solutions to its own economic troubles. And so solving the problems of the South has taken second place. The main aim of the Cancun summit will be to restart the North-South dialogue after the stalemate of the late 1970s. Despite years of growth in the Third World, most of its people still suffer from grinding poverty. The leaders meeting at Cancun will attempt to establish a formula which will revive the world's economy. The plan will have to recognize the interdependence of the North and the South. The Cancun meeting was one of the recommendations of the Brandt Commission report. The group was set up independently in 1977 under the chairmanship of the West German statesman Willy Brandt. Its objective was to find ways in which the North-South dialogue could become more meaningful. When the Commission published its findings in 1979, it made many specific recommendations. It stressed the urgency of finding permanent remedies to alleviate human suffering around the world. The North-South dialogue only exists because of a series of events in the mid-70s. Initially, the United States and the West wanted to turn the dialogue into a forum where they could negotiate with the Arab oil-producing countries and thus try to minimize the impact of the 1973 oil price rises. The Mideastern countries agreed to such talks, but only if they also included discussions on how to bridge the gap between rich and poor. At one of their annual meetings just over a year ago, the leaders of 7 of the world's most powerful nations came close to abandoning the idea of a summit between rich and poor countries. After the Venice summit, it was reported that the British Prime Minister and her officials resisted committing themselves to such a dialogue. It is now alleged that the only reason the British are attending the Cancun summit is so that nothing will be decided without them. Another complication was the election of a new American administration. The Reagan government called for the postponement of last March's meeting. This year, at the Ottawa summit, the Canadian Prime Minister and the French President publicly backed the idea of a North-South summit. At this meeting, all the delegations agreed to maintain or increase their official aid, and to make sure that the poorest countries got more help. But the British Foreign Secretary added a note of caution.
The Brandt Commission obliges us to focus on these problems and objectives in all their diversity. But I think that the idea, sometimes you hear now, the idea of a sharp polarity between North and South is much too simple. The requirements of a country like Brazil will be quite different from those in the African poverty belt. And certainly my concern is to see international relations placed on a sensible and practical footing and to escape the risk of a North-South confrontation.
And the limited
The North's own economic woes make it difficult for political leaders to make foreign aid commitments. Since 1979, unemployment has risen from 18 million to almost 26 million in the north, and economic forecasts are bleak. Interest rates and inflation are expected to remain high. But compared to the enormous problems in the Third World, the difficulties of the North seem small. What is needed is to find new solutions to old problems. In the last decade, the industrialized nations have spent billions of dollars in aid. But most poor countries in the South are still no better off. In fact, for some, the situation has become even worse. The problems affecting the poverty belts of Africa and Asia are basic. Many countries still can't feed their own people. They can't grow enough food or import enough either. Hunger and famine are still common in many parts of the world. Food aid programs solve the problem temporarily, but in many areas the handouts eventually inhibit local food production. A recent World Bank study has estimated that almost 1.5 billion people barely get enough to eat. The study goes on to say that half of these people survive on starvation rations. Malnutrition permanently affects a child's ability to learn and an adult's capacity to work. In some low-income countries, studies show that almost half of preschool children are malnourished. Between 1950 and 1975, food production in the developing countries actually rose. But the demand for food increased too, as populations grew and became more affluent. One solution put forward by the Brandt Commission is the establishment of national population programs. The purpose of these programs would be to ensure a reasonable balance between population and resources. But poverty usually leads to too many children, because children are insurance for old age. And in the South, children work, bring in money, help in the fields. But most important, children feed you when you are too old or sick to do it yourself. Despite a falling birth rate in the last 2 decades, the population of the Third World is likely to double by the year 2020. Every 5 days, 1 million people are added to the world's population. By the year 2000, the population of our planet is likely to have increased from 4 billion to almost 7 billion. And in the next century, it could double. Expanded and more effective family planning services are needed. It is in some of the poorest African and Asian countries, like Bangladesh and Pakistan, that birth rates aren't falling as significantly as in other areas of the world. The Brandt Commission report recommended that family planning advice should be freely available and part of new social welfare programs to promote social change.
फिर उसके बाद फिर नया पैकेट शुरू करना है। हाँ, तो ये जितनी देर तक गोली बजा ऑपरेशन होता है, वो एक पीठ में सुई लगाते हैं औरत को, फिर उसके बाद वो सारा उसका आधा हिस्सा सुन्न हो जाता है। ये गोलियां हैं इस तरह से 28 गोलियां हैं। इसमें इस पैकेट में तो 21 गोलियां हैं। 21 का भी है, 20 का, 28 का ऐसे है।
Since it is women who must bear and rear children, family planning must get to them first. And studies have shown that in most countries, women want to limit the size of their families, but often their husbands won't cooperate. To improve the effectiveness of such national population programs, both men and women will have to be educated in order to change social values. And these programs will be greatly strengthened if they go hand in hand with community development. In the future, Nigeria and Bangladesh may have as many people as the United States and the Soviet Union today. The Brandt Commission says that to meet the challenge of poverty, ill health, and hunger, it is important to limit excessive population growth. But family planning should be just one part of comprehensive health care programs. The North has a lot to offer the South in this area. The Brent report argues that health will only be improved when enough clean water is available and sanitation is widespread. Many of the diseases in the Third World can be avoided by the use of simple preventative measures. An inexpensive medication can provide effective treatment for many of the illnesses to be found in the developing world. In India, infants born 2 to 4 years apart have a 1/3 better chance of living past the age of 1 than infants born less than 2 years apart. And the South must ensure that they train their own people to be able to improve all aspects of general health. Healthier babies are more productive human beings in the long run. Infant mortality statistics are usually a good indicator of the general health and life expectancy of a country. So the nutritional welfare of babies is very important, especially in the first few months of their lives. Breastfeeding provides infants with adequate nutrition and initial protection against disease. It's a natural activity and one that can significantly lower infant mortality. The newly refined milk powder substitutes can't recreate the essential properties of breast milk. Despite the advantages of the natural product, artificial substitutes are still gaining ground in many developing countries. It's up to the nations of the North to establish guiding principles so that international businesses do not promote their products to people who don't know how they should be used. The hard-pressed economies of the South have another burden to bear: refugees. 250 million people are believed to have fled their homelands in this century. In the last 2 years alone, 3,000 people a day have become refugees. In Africa, there are some 4 million, and little has been done to resettle them. Around the world, it is estimated there are 10 million people without a homeland. To improve their condition, emergency measures are necessary. Their human rights must be guaranteed. They must be protected and cared for in temporary settlements. And permanent solutions, resettlement or voluntary repatriation, must be negotiated. Illiteracy and other educational problems will not be easily overcome. To make progress, the countries of the South must improve basic education. Adult literacy classes are needed, along with compulsory primary school education for children. And basic primary schooling would mean the expansion of secondary education. From this base, third world nations could go on to increase their own technically skilled population, and then rely less on experts from the North. The Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Yamani, became a figure instantly recognized across the world as a result of the 1973-74 oil crisis. For long years, the oil reserves of oil-producing countries, especially in the Middle East, had been exploited by Western companies, which made huge profits. Then, almost without warning, the oil-producing countries grouped together in OPEC decided to demand the true market price. Throughout the world, almost overnight, buying petrol became a motorist's nightmare. OPEC had decided not only to quadruple the price of crude oil, they also voted to cut back production by 25%. The OPEC decisions can be seen in retrospect as a determined effort by countries of the South to make the North sit up and take notice of them. As here in Mexico, the producing countries now showed a determination to exploit their own oil fields with their own personnel, making sure that the profits were not siphoned off by foreign oil companies. The oil crisis of 8 years ago found an echo in September 1980, when the Iran-Iraq war removed about 5 million barrels of oil per day from the world market. By now, the West was learning to live with high oil prices, cutting back demand and eliminating waste. But third world countries without oil of their own were in a desperate situation. OPEC responded well to this new situation. The last thing it wanted to do was damage the economies of the lesser developed countries. OPEC has decided to set up a special aid fund from its profits, incorporating a three-tier approach. The poorest countries are to receive direct grants to offset price rises. Middle-tier countries are to get a mixture of grants and commercial loans, while better developed countries are to be offered standard commercial loans. Meanwhile, the search continues for alternative energy sources.
We must move from the present international economy, primarily dependent on hydrocarbons, to one increasingly based on new and renewable sources of energy.
The Indian Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, favors nuclear energy. But these demonstrators at a UN energy conference in Kenya have a more earthy approach. Plant more trees. The trouble with using firewood, though, is that it takes a long time to replace. And the end result, compounded by land clearance for farming and the constant demand for wood products by industrialized countries, is serious deforestation. The soil becomes impoverished and erodes, and then landslides can lead to rivers silting up and overflowing their banks. Power from the sun is the most attractive of the alternatives. Sunshine is free and is always available somewhere on Earth, especially in many of the world's poorest regions. The same is often true of wind. Experiments with solar panels are well advanced. Homes and buildings in many countries already get their central heating and hot water in this way. Rural Kenya is meeting local energy requirements in a less glamorous way, using cows. Or more precisely, what the cow leaves behind. Cow dung is readily available and absolutely free. The farmer merely has to collect it and place it in a large vat. Added to the waste is an equal quantity of water. It doesn't have to be clean water either. The mixture slowly ferments and produces odorless and heat-giving methane gas. What could be simpler or cheaper?
Sorry? No.
This milking machine operates on a mixture of 75% biogas and 25% diesel oil, and it has done so successfully for over 20 years. Without water, though, there can be no life. Over half the people in the third world do not have clean water to drink. Often, fetching water is an exhausting and time-consuming business. The United Nations, last November, launched the Decade of Water with the aim of bringing fresh water within reach of all mankind. With food, as with water, the United Nations has its specialized agencies and funds to help the less developed countries. The North-South report compiled by the Brandt Commission recognizes the great work performed by the UN and by its affiliated organizations, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But it faces ever-expanding tasks. It must be strengthened and made more efficient. Poverty and disease go hand in hand with hunger. Since so many people are thought to live on an inadequate diet, greater food production is a constant aim of nearly all developing countries. The lucky ones have a surplus of valuable cash crops like coffee, which they can trade on the international market. Sugarcane is another crop which is favored by regional climatic conditions. The Caribbean is the main source of this, and Cuba, for example, cut back its plans to diversify the economy when it found that it still made economic sense to concentrate on sugar exports. A major disadvantage for third world producers is the fact that, on average, they receive less than 25% of final consumer prices for their produce. To a large degree, this is because of the market power lying in the hands of importers, processors, and distributors, backed in nearly all cases with capital from the north. But so far, countries producing any particular commodity have been unable to do what OPEC did with oil. Prices on international markets for many commodities can fluctuate wildly. The Brent report says secure supplies and stable prices are in the interest of South and North, and they can be achieved with the help of a common fund contributed to by industrialized countries. One sad statistic is the massive sum of $450 billion spent on arms throughout the world in 1980. If resources on this scale were directed toward helping those in need, the imbalance between North and South would not be the grave problem it is. But a disturbing trend is the increasing amounts of money spent on weapons by the Third World. During the last decade, its share of the arms trade nearly doubled, and military spending in general continues to rise at an annual rate of 2% in real terms. That's about the same as the overall growth in the world's economy. Meanwhile, the people of the Third World are becoming increasingly aware of social and political realities. Here, victims of hunger march angrily in West Bengal, openly accusing officials of bad management and corruption over food supplies. It's unfortunately true that in many poor countries, food supplies and other aid do finish up in the hands of corrupt officials. That's why the Brandt Report and the United Nations agencies agree that in the long term, developing countries must become completely self-sufficient and not depend on donations from outside in order to survive. Short-term aid, however, is still needed in order to finance development projects. But at the September meeting of the International Monetary Fund, Third World delegates must have been dismayed by the stern recipe of self-help urged by President Ronald Reagan.
Unless a nation puts its own financial and economic house in order, no amount of aid will produce progress. Many countries are recognizing this fact and taking dramatic steps to get their economies back on a sound footing. And I know it's not easy. I have a few scars to prove that fact, but it must be done.
President Reagan's strict monetarist view that poor countries must depend primarily on their own efforts provides small comfort to the masses of Third World slum dwellers. For them, life is a day-to-day battle for the basic essentials of survival. The humanitarian principle of giving aid to those in need is enshrined in the United Nations Charter and in the world's religions. But in times of recession, even the prosperous countries put development aid low on their list of priorities. Then, the chances of any aid filtering through to those at the very bottom of the ladder shrink to zero. The North-South Summit in Mexico, itself a country of much poverty, aims to make a new start. To create a new world economic system transcending short-term national interests. It's a goal based on the simple premise that all nations need each other, on the belief that no human being should go hungry when there is surplus food anywhere else in the world.